Good afternoon, everyone. This is Sowmiya Ashok. I'm reporting for ThePrint from Colombo at the moment. Currently, it's a warm afternoon, a Monday afternoon in Colombo. There's actually quite heavy police presence across the main road, starting from the Prime Minister's house at Temple Trees all the way down to the Gota Gogama protest. So I have been here since Thursday afternoon. And just to give you some impressions from the ground to lay down the foundation, I'll start with that. And then in about 10-15 minutes, please feel free to ask me questions in the Q&A box. So what I try to do so far is catch the mood because what we've seen in the last few weeks is and in fact, the last 1 month has been a huge sort of public swell that led to the resignation of Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa on May 9th. So one of the things I felt the need to immediately understand is how does the fuel shortage and the domestic gas shortage that we're reading about in the press and seeing from India, how does that play out on the ground? And starting from the time that I landed, I think these were signs that were very apparent. So I wrote a piece about sort of a contradictory view, I guess, when you land in the airport where you're looking for economic distress, but it's quite a lot of opulence as you walk through the duty-free shops to get out. And I started chatting with a young man who sells local SIM cards, and we had noticed some Russian tourists around, so I was asking about them, and it seems that Sri Lanka in general gets a lot of Russians and Ukrainian tourists. And recently, about a month ago, the government actually relaxed and made the extension of these visas free. So it is an attempt to garner more foreign exchange, something that has been massively hit during the pandemic. So as I wound my way into Colombo, there were actually massive lines that I witnessed, something that you'll be very familiar with if you've seen the news, that there were vehicles lining up on the sides. Our colleague, my colleague Vandana Menon, who was here about a month ago, she talked about how there are two lines on Colombo roads, one stranded waiting to refuel and the other is moving traffic. So what I witnessed were long queues of tuk-tuks lining up. Tuk-tuks is their version of our auto rickshaws. And further down in a more working class neighborhood, I saw a long line of people waiting to refuel their gas cylinders. And when I stopped to talk with them, I speak Tamil, I'm from Chennai, so I could communicate a little with the Tamils here. And some of them also helped out in translation and so on. And what we found was this was a dire situation going on for months now, but some of them had been in line for nearly 3-4 days, coming back very early despite a curfew. So in fact, in the recent days, there's been emergency powers that have been in place, which has put in place a curfew in Sri Lanka. So when it came to the situation of refueling, they were telling me how for 3-4 days continuously there was a problem in actually the supply of gas. So further down, I've spent Friday and Saturday and even yesterday in the Vesak Buddhist Festival, which is yesterday and today, getting to know and understanding the actual site of the people's movement that we've seen here. As you would see in visuals of some of the reporting I've done, but also from news media, that what the site is happening, where the protests are happening, is right in front of the Secretariat. So it's quite a heavily guarded building. And just outside it are rows and rows of tents and people gathering. Because what we saw was this swell of public support, I felt that certain amount of time should be spent trying to understand some of the sentiments coming out. And I landed on the day I landed that evening at 6:30 p.m. Was the new prime minister was sworn in. So that was Ranil Wickremesinghe. He was sworn in for the 6th time in Sri Lanka's history, political history. And he was seen as a person who will help tide over this economic crisis. So this economic crisis, as you know and you're familiar with, I'll just give a quick note before I come back to the protest side, but it talks, it is essentially a whole combination of bad policies, which also got exacerbated by the pandemic. So in fact, prior to the pandemic, Sri Lanka was even known as an upper middle income country, but things went south after that. And what we saw with the economic crisis is a huge depletion of foreign reserves because the tourism sector in Sri Lanka was entirely destroyed because of the pandemic. And following which some, policies such as going organic entirely about a year ago, which led to huge losses in rice production and even their main tea production. So these things have been really bad, which then, due to higher inflation and loss of foreign exchange in terms of importing things, has led to fuel shortages and so on. So on Thursday, when I landed, one of the biggest political stories that day was this sort of swearing in of the new prime minister, who was in some ways seen as a person who is there to fix the economic problems. He had said in interviews prior to this that he was, had experience in these kinds of, in sort of sorting out the economy previously. He'd also expressed that at this stage, Sri Lanka needs a leader who focuses on getting the economy back on track, and they shouldn't be focusing too much on whether they have numbers in parliament and so on. So the interesting thing is he has exactly one seat in parliament. And what we're seeing tomorrow, that is Tuesday here in Sri Lanka, you would see a no confidence motion in parliament to prove if Ranil Wickremesinghe in fact has the numbers, which he needs about 113 in the 225 member parliament. So what I spent the weekend doing was trying to understand two things. Who are the protesters who came in large numbers to, manage to in some ways oust the Rajapaksa regime? And secondly, how did they deal with Ranil's, swearing in or appointment? So the first part, which I was looking for the answers, was who are they, where did they come from? And some of them, and there's a story that I filed on Saturday, which was in some detail going into the dynamics of the protest site. So one interesting thing about the venue was it is to the left of the secretariat. And I believe one of them told me, one of the protesters, that few years ago, it was President Gotabaya Rajapaksa who'd actually nominated that specific site to be the demonstration site, largely for taking people away from in front of his office and moving them to the side. And what has happened today has been that has become into an organic village, sort of, I don't mean that in an organic growing sort of sense, but organically grown into a village which has its own kitchen, has its own, entertainment library, so on and so forth, where people are here for the long haul. When I walked around the space asking about what they thought about the change in guard in appointing Ranil Wickremesinghe, most of them didn't see this as a positive thing. They said, what is the point of changing heads? We want a change in system. They didn't think Ranil was a legitimate sort of leader of the country. Many of them said that he's done this in the past. He's going to be as corrupt as the Rajapaksas. They also said that he was brought in simply to bail out the Rajapaksas. There's currently a travel ban on Mahinda Rajapaksa leaving the country. Perhaps he will help, help the family flee. But at the bottom line, despite all of this, and despite this major event that took place just before I got here, which is May 9th, where protesters were violently attacked by goons who allegedly were sort of put up by the ruling party, where many of their property was, the tents, their sort of art, a lot of them were injured. There were 8 casualties across the country, which also led to a lot of burning of infrastructure, largely, to do with the family and charring of buses and so on. So with the appointment of Ranil Wickremesinghe, we'll know tomorrow, and it's slightly tense today in Colombo because of all of this. As I mentioned at the beginning, there was this huge police and army presence everywhere. And this also is a week where May 18th is a very important day for Sri Lanka, Sri Lankan Tamil specifically, where they is a remembrance day for them, and especially in Mullaitivu, where it was supposed to be a significant day of the war ending, and they come out in large numbers to remember those who are departed. So I will just quickly walk through some of the questions that I've received, and then feel free to ask me more in the Q&A. The question I've got is, where is China in this situation? And also, is there any mention of India in the local Sri Lankan media during the continuing crisis? So where is China at the moment is when I've spoken to people on the ground, there doesn't seem to be a lot of mention of China, although the setting is very interesting. When you're standing at the site and looking away from the secretariat on the other side, what you're actually seeing is a Chinese port city. There's a whole space that has been bought by China to build a gigantic port city. So even if China is not on anybody's lips, I didn't hear them directly refer to it on the site. You do have this looming presence of a huge amount of activities, infrastructure activities going on just beyond the site. In fact, one of the protesters, he runs a small first aid tent, and he laughed, saying he was standing at the China border because he feels in few months, Sri Lankans might need a passport to go across. They also pointed out the large two big hotels and a sort of a big mall that is just behind the protest site, which is also apparently somehow linked to or bought by China. So in terms of the presence, there's a looming presence. There's also a lot of Chinese people in Colombo. I speak a little bit of Mandarin, and so was walking around and trying to understand where some of them came from. They work in Sri Lanka in various companies, and true to form, many Chinese do not actually speak to foreigners and definitely do not speak to foreign journalists. So I cannot bring you more as to what they're doing here. But there is definitely a presence of people walking around and these big infrastructure. There is talk of amongst academics and think tanks on how this will play out. People discuss the debt trap, as so to speak. There are heavy presence of Chinese influence in the Rajapaksa's province, Hambantota province, where there is a big port there. And so there are larger, factors at play here on how exactly this is going to go ahead with the new prime minister leading the show. Whether India is in the local media, yes, repeatedly for its help sort of sending across aid. It has been registered to be a help and an aid, and also that Ranil Wickremesinghe seemed to have a good working relationship with India. So there is discussions on people he meets from the Indian side. There was also news recently of a big, diesel export from India as an aid or help, or like, as you say, credit line extended to Sri Lanka. So there is news about India on and off. The other one is about, what steps educated people in Sri Lanka could have taken to prevent the economic crisis, and what's happened all of a sudden. I guess educated people, if you think of a certain class of people, just as you can think of in India, perhaps they did not think that this was so severe, or this economic crisis will actually affect them at the end of the day. What is interesting about this people's movement is it has caught everybody unaware. It's caught a whole section, across sections, across ethnic groups, across religions, unawares about, oh, this is actually an economic problem where I'm starving and my fuel tanks are empty. What they could have done previously, I think, been more vocal about their own government's functioning. Frankly, I've only been here a few days, so I cannot be a commentator on what has happened so far. But I've met some, Sri Lankan elites who are part of the protest. Elites because they are prominent figures in art, as artists, as prominent figures as film personalities. Some of them had come to the protest site to drop off provisions, and I had a chat with them. And some of them said, they have been calling out the dirty politics of the Rajapaksa government for a very long time. So it isn't a new thing that they're part of it, but this has created a certain awareness among people, and an awareness that protest is not for me. Suddenly it seems, just like in India, we can say that some people frown upon this expression. Here it seems like it's been one of the situations where people have had to come together to fight against this, or call for the president to resign. Do I see the economy recovering at least a little bit? Would be a question definitely to wait and watch. At this stage, it seems extremely dire. The shortages are very, very real. The ration shortages are very real. Because I have had the opportunity to stay in a little more affluent Gulf face area, in a hotel for foreigners. The power supply hasn't been terrible to deal with. But speaking to my friends and colleagues who live, friends and people I know in the media who live in Colombo, there seems to be huge power cuts, which is a big problem for the economy. The other day, just wandering around the local mall, which I said was owned by the Chinese, people were literally sitting in darkness. The shops were all dark and they were quietly sitting in there. And I asked my Sinhalese friend what was happening. And she said, this is the reality. We don't have power for 5-6 hours a day, or maybe more, depending on where you live. So the economy hugely depends on a regular power supply. That's a huge problem because of the fuel shortage. And food is starting to be a real issue. So in terms of recovery, we will have to see what kind of conversations the new prime minister is going to have once he gets support tomorrow, if he manages to make the numbers in parliament. Reports of police excesses, most of what I'm hearing is from the north. I think what has shifted here is that a certain section, as they say, the Tamil population has always lived with a certain fear of militarization, right? And for the first time, commentators here in Colombo say the Sinhalese population, the Sinhalese Buddhist population, are largely shocked by how the same military, the same state has now turned against them. So what is interesting here is a lived experience that people in the South, the more Sinhala dominant South is facing, about what people in the North have generally faced for many years. So the reports I've heard, and I'm about to travel to the North tomorrow for the rest of this week, so I'll be in a better position to talk after that, to comment about the situation. But I believe in just the Vesak Buddhist festival that we saw yesterday and today, there's been certain complaints in the north about how that has played out, where they say that there's been heavy militarization. Some people have been slapped with court orders, even to stop them from coming out on the Remembrance Day on May 18th. So I'm yet to sort of dive into this for me to answer this in a more comprehensive way. Please feel free to add more questions as you go along. The other sort of factor that I found quite interesting was the demographics of a protest like this. And I think that is something that the government is quite interested and wary of, I think, watching. And in fact, Ranil Wickremesinghe has even talked about setting up a committee to support the protesters, whatever that means. So we need to wait and see. But what I saw amongst the protesters, at least, was this complete sort of eclectic mix of very political inter-university student federation groups, Buddhist monks, nuns, and so on and so forth. So as in India, we've seen people's movements and we've often found one person heading the whole show. But here that one person seems to sort of be missing so it seems like a more leaderless and a more democratic space, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have its set of issues. Non-governmental organizations are definitely playing a huge role. There are people on the site and others talking vocally about it online. There are people at the site offering donations. So nearly everything that's come up in the last month has been based on donations that people have dropped off. So there's a lot of mobilizing of funds that are coming in across civil society. And people are taking up all kinds of issues. And I think one interesting thing about this protest site is you're talking about multiple things under the umbrella of the economic crisis. So there's quite a group of issues and which observers hope that it will lead to some kind of a sustainable unity in the future. So I spoke to a young lawyer 2 days ago who talked about intensive anti-Muslim sort of sentiments about 2 years ago under the Rajapaksa government. Even 2 years ago, things were extremely hard. Things were extremely difficult for the minority population, something that we might be familiar with in India. And what was interesting about that is he said, I thought at that stage there was no hope for this country, that we will never get over these kinds of divisions. And today we're in a situation simply because all our stomachs are empty and our homes don't have electricity or fuel, that we've come together, and this unifying factor is something that is very interesting. But having said that, if you dig deeply and if you look harder at what really the situation is, you'd find that it's not entirely cushy. There's, of course, places where this has opened up an opportunity to talk about uh, ways in which people can be more equal and less discriminatory of each other. I think the upcoming trip to the north will give me more insights on how different populations are dealing with the economic crisis. What we've seen, and the focus so far has been largely Colombo. I think what you've read in India is also how is Colombo doing, what kind of fuel shortages are we seeing there. The visuals have all been about the Gota Go Home sort of protest site. But this particular crisis is playing out in multiple ways across the country. And yes, that's exactly right. The difficulties are very, very different for different layers of society. And again, like, as you know, there's a large sort of indentured population of tea plantation workers. Many of them have come for many years ago from Tamil Nadu. And so there's a certain, because of the last 2 years of massive economic mismanagement, tea supplies, tea exports have fallen massively, and it's been a huge, problem for the economy, because they say in Sri Lanka, textiles and tea is extremely important here, and tea is something that has been hit quite badly. With, again, just going out of Colombo, getting a sense of where things are would be a different perspective, of course, and I'm looking forward to bringing more stories from the ground. So please do follow us on ThePrint. If there are any more questions, I would love to hear. Please do add it onto your chat box. There's a question on whether people are selling gold or properties. Honestly, I haven't come across any such sort of reports yet. I will definitely keep an eye out and get back to you through my reports if I find anything. I do know just a word, as I mentioned before, about the Russian tourists that were coming in. That was an interesting aside for me, which I'm going to explore. Many of them are coming on work from home, work from home from Sri Lanka, where they're apparently going further south onto the island and staying here on long-term visas. So it seems to me that the crisis in Europe pales in comparison to, this pales in comparison to what is happening back home. So many of them come straight here for a while. Pardon me. I guess if there's anything else, I would love to hear from you. I'm on the call for another about 5 more minutes. And looking forward to bringing more stories. I think often from the cities, we get one perspective, but it'd be really good to get different people to deliberate on what's happened. I have spent some time speaking to political leaders. I spoke to the former commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. The interview will be out soon. And I'm going to go ahead and meet as many political leaders to try and understand their thoughts on what's happening. And some of them have even compared what is happening in Sri Lanka with the economic crisis in the 90s that India sort of saw. So there's also lessons to be learned and people who can save the situation. And we'll know tomorrow with the new cabinet how that's going to play out. I don't really think there's been a huge comparative data yet. I'm sorry, I wouldn't really know this. But I do think the situation hasn't really improved. So in yesterday itself, someone was telling me the inflation levels are much higher and things are extremely expensive, even to buy turmeric. Someone was outraged by buying turmeric was so expensive. So I will get back to you definitely on that question once I dig a little deeper on the economic indicators here. And I think if there are no more questions, I would thank you very, very much for joining us today. And look, please do track my reporting from the ground in Colombo. This is Sowmiya Ashok. I'm a senior editor for The Print, and I look forward to bringing you more stories. Thank you so much.